Okay, well, I'm ready here. We're going to do our lecture on the technology of Ascension. Okay, so then I want to thank my hosts here on Ascension Dynamics and uh, for making this lecture possible. And we're going to start with a short lecture series on kind of the physics background of what's called Ascension, transmutation. And then there's a slideshow. So most of you know that my name is Dan Winter, fractalfield.com, therify.net, theimploder.com, and we have been teaching the physics of its ascension from my background of electrical engineering and systems analyst with IBM for quite some time. I consider this a pretty useful opportunity to emphasize how important it is that we transition as people focused on spiritual evolution to a more scientific language as we talk about these things. Otherwise, we won't gain the respect we need from governments and universities and be able to influence the public as needs to happen. And also, we won't have the precision of understanding to transition religion into a science that's perfectly shareable. So there are many reasons why we need a very precise engineering language to talk about this kind of the science of ascension. And sometimes we call it other levels of density, and we think of ascension as moving into the next dimension, and there's all these words we use, and we feel passionate about these words, and we've had experiences that go with them. But if you should happen to want to communicate with the science community and therefore the world, we're going to need a more accurate language. And what we create when we have these bliss experiences, sometimes called the rainbow body or the Kesjan body or the Ba from the Ka, as we say, there are too many words for this phenomena and not enough engineering. And those are the issues we're here to talk about. And I have a lifetime of experience working on these things. As you know, my background was psychophysiology in University of Detroit, biofeedback engineer in graduate school after electrical engineering as an undergraduate. And subsequently, we have, 6 or 7 apps on the App Store in biofeedback, iThrive.com, ithrve.com, and flameinmind.com, notably. And we've pioneered the definition of heart coherence, realheartcoherence.com. So I have a passionate background in the physics and psychophysiology of emotion, and as that might have to do with understanding the physics of what's been called ascension. So let's get right down to it. What do we mean when we say, ascend already, we need the space? No, what do we mean when we say, what is the real science of ascension? And people say they have quote-unquote other dimensional experiences, and these are other dimensional beings that appear to us sometimes. And this language, frankly, is alienating. It's unprofessional, it's inaccurate, it's not helpful. We must have a better language to talk about these things, or we're never going to progress and make these experiences shareable. But it happens now that we actually do. So, essentially what happens in the aura when we have bliss, and first I'm going to talk about this, and then later we're going to do the slides, the pictures. What actually happens is the aura becomes centripetal. It gathers by compressing charge, what we say implosively. And that process, which is literally the physics of bliss, is identifiable with a frequency signature, a harmonic content, which is very clear and identified by equation. The equation is named origin of biologic negentropy, and you take this Planck length, which is the universal radio of the universe and the universal radio of DNA, and you multiply by golden ratio, and then you keep doing that, integer exponents of golden ratio, and you get a harmonic cascade that predicts the brainwave frequencies of bliss, the sacrocranial spine liquid plump harmonics of bliss. It predicts the breath harmonics for bliss. It predicts the heart rate variability, low frequencies of the heart, harmonics of bliss. It predicts the Schumann harmonics of the planet for bliss. And this is all a simple caduceus cascade of charge implosion. Literally, non-destructive charge collapse. This is the famous Bucky Fuller vector flexor, which I work with him extensively on this work, actually, from cube octa to ecosa to dodeca to octa to tetra. Now, this is an example of non-destructive charge collapse if this is understood in terms of wave mechanics. And it is wave mechanics, for example, that Platonic sequence tetracube dodeca ecosa is specifically the valence electron series which assembles the atomic table, the SPDF, S being toroidal, pi being tetracubic, and DF 510, 1014 electron pair being dodeca ecosa. So that Platonic nest, as in star mother, kit, goldenmean.info/kit, is literally not just how the electron shells do charge collapse, non-destructive charge collapse, the true physics of fusion and alchemy, but it's also the geometry of how the nucleus is assembled, the hadrons assemble, also in a very specific Platonic nest, as you can see all those pictures at goldenmean.info/creation. So, the way the atomic table got centripetal, that stellation of dodeca ecosa all by golden ratio, is also on a larger scale the way your aura gets centripetal and implosive. So when we talk about these higher dimensional experiences, often people use the term other densities. But in order to understand what the other densities are, we actually need to understand the symmetry language. So for example, if you were to take the tetracube symmetry, which you can almost see in the star with the kit in the center, there's a blue cube here. And now if I tilt that blue cube by 32 degrees, the chin angle sphinx, I have this pent dodeca here, which, if you stellate by golden ratio to ecosa and then golden ratio to dodeca, and then keep doing that infinitely, you get the only possible three-dimensional fractal. And I later proved the radii of hydrogen. Hydrogen is that fractal because it's implosive charge collapse, which non-destructive charge collapse was Einstein's name for the solution to the unified field, and non-destructive charge collapse is the only physics of alchemy and the only physics of fusion, and non-destructive compression is the only solution to most every problem we've ever had, from alchemy to urban design to architecture to the history of computing to the history of language. It's all about implosive charge collapse. And later, for those who studied it, as we've emphasized many times, it's quite clearly the physics of successful death. There's literally a charged black hole that is contagious, that identifies successful electrical death, which is the propagation of this longitudinal coherence field we're about to talk about as the physics of ascension. So, I just used the term longitudinal coherence field, and I think, as I've done many parallel lectures to this, many of you have a sense of what we mean by longitudinal interferometry. The longitudinal wave is the compressional part of the electromagnetic wave that travels parallel to the direction of propagation. And unfortunately, all of our electrical engineering background for radio and communications uses only the transverse up and down component electromagnetic wave, which does not go as far. Whereas the compressional component, the longitudinal component, can go literally infinitely and go through about anything, including a Faraday cage, and create action at a distance, because when that compressional wave crosses itself at a distance, it can resynthesize the up and down component at a node where the vortex pine cones kiss noses, and the compressional component exchanges inertia with the transverse up and down component, and that's actually the physics of getting those vortex lined up symmetrically, first in a tetracube called four-wave mixing in the physics of phase conjugate optics, where negentropy was discovered and measured first, and called the sacred four directions and all the sacred traditions, the Aboriginal, etc. So that ability for waves to cross accurately at a distance resynthesizes that compressional node bounce point. And the bounce point where this compressional wave interacts becomes a kind of synaptic grid, literally an array for awareness. Now we want to talk about what an array is, how an array of spark gaps can be the unpacking of awareness, which is literally the way in which your aura gets big, the only way, actually. Now, this is actually not surprising in the sense that, you know, we know that you inhabit an array now. It's called the synapses, the spark gaps inside your brain. It's an array of sparks. Call it Indra's net, if you like. And so when the sparks get coherent and they set up these vortex, then suddenly the plasma going through the spark gaps creates the centripetal vortex. And I give you the very primary example that when you interview the children learning to see without their eyes, by doing that same brainwave harmonic series, alpha beta golden ratio, called flameinmind.com, and you can see the outer vision project. We teach kids to see without their eyes every day. And each one of those kids says the same thing. Oh yeah, when I close my eyes, if I have this trance bliss experience, then I see this vortex tornado tunnel form inside my head, and I look through the tunnel, an eyeball appears, and I can see through it. Now, these are kids that are absolutely blindfolded, and they see very clearly. The same way that medical doctors see when they leave their body during death experience, well documented. The reason you see through a vortex is this vortex tunnel converges and creates an eyeball, literally at the Planck threshold, where the waves are sorted, which is called the phase conjugate physics of the origin of vision and perception. Fractalfield.com/conjugate perception. Point being that it all started with this array of spark gap synapses inside your head, but then that little vortex tornado, which creates vision, is not limited to your head. Very simple. As long as that vortex tornado is imploding, you can take that little eyeball anywhere you out, outside your head. Astral travel, remote viewing, plasma projection, shamanic vision, near-death experience. There's 100 names. Lucid dreaming. So the electrical issue is whether your plasma vortex tornado is coherent enough to be propagating. The word for this is Shem-An. Shem means access to a black hole. Shem, Lachem. And An means sun god. Well, a shaman is literally someone who can plasma project this vortex. So how does that enlighten what we mean when we say, have you ascended? You see, sometimes I lie here, right behind me on this little couch here. There happens to be a very strong magnetic line going up to Cathar, sacred mountain, Mount Canigou. And that is a compressional line. You remember when the Cozy Rev mirrors were installed to make military quality telepathy, you had to measure the nanotesla flux density of the magnetic lines, find the place where they cross, and install a coherent microwave cylinder column tube. And then you had military quality telepathy. Literally, the physics of DNA radio requires this compression node where these longitudinal waves can bounce in an array, and you inhabit the array. So, when I lie here on this couch right behind me, and the strong magnetic lines, and then I close my eyes, and after 30 years of Kundalini, and I close my eyes, and particularly at sunrise and sunset, we also know the physics, it's four-wave mixing, right-angle phase conjugates. I see this huge column of light and pictures, and also my blood sugar gets burnt pretty quickly, and I have this flash of plasma light, and I can ask questions, and I can see visions, and it's very psychedelic, and it can be somewhat dangerous because it burns blood sugar very fast. It can be very ungrounding because if you don't have a point of reference from which to return, I just went out before this lecture and I stuck my feet in the mountain cold water out there because I knew the importance of grounding, because all grounding is access to fractality, which is phase locking, to Planck, which is the ability to charge implode and gives you the phase lock reference to the rest of the universe, as it were. Otherwise, you get spaced out. You float away. Well, so when we say, you've achieved ascension, or you've made your rainbow light body, or you've taken the ba from the ka, what do we actually mean electrically? We mean that you've been able to implode a charge bubble around your body your aura. It's measurable. GDV is a way to do an example. And as that aura becomes more centripetal, becomes more spin dense, we call it other densities. And the reason it becomes more spin dense is a recursive braid embedding process, which is literally moving to the next dimension. So let's make this very specific. And again, we're going to play the pictures in a minute, but we're going to start with a conversation. So if you took a tetracube and tilted it at 32 degrees and then rotate it and blink 5 times, then you have that pentadodeca. You've all seen our Merkaba pictures, goldenmean.info/Merkaba. When that cube rotates into the next dimension and forms the pentadodeca, 5 cubes in a pentadodecahedron, the edge length ratio for the first time becomes golden ratio. Now, that is literally the next dimension in the sense of superposed axes of charge spin symmetry. So when that happens, the frequency signature, the power spectra, the harmonic series that you would get from that electrical array would have an additional harmonic. Now, if you took that pentadodecahedron and you ratchet down a helix, you'd have a perfect map of DNA. It's gorgeous. goldenmean.info/DNA manifesto. Lots of pictures. So now that dodecahedron, you could think of it as a 4th dimension for the cube. It is a 4th axis of spin superposed. Now that dodecahedron has another dimension. It's been braided down, so it's a 5D cube, literally. Okay. Now you take that thread and you braid, and you braid the braid of the braid on the braid, and thread to string to rope to fat rope. And you see what's happening each time is a longer wave is embedding or nesting on a shorter wave phase coherently, and it turns out that the ratio of the long wave, the short wave, that would allow non-destructive electrical compression between them, which is perfected, is golden mean ratio, because it is the generalized solution to constructive wave interference, and we have the equations. You can see them. fractalfield.com/vacuum energy. So we've published all these equations, the Navier-Stokes equations, generalized wave equations, to prove electrically that golden ratio is the generalized wave mechanic solution to constructive wave interference, and therefore constructive compression, and therefore implosion, and therefore the cause of gravity, and therefore the cause of negentropy, therefore the cause of centripetal force. It's a very important subject. It is literally the perfect fractality. As we've said many times, many physicists already knew that fractality causes gravity, but very few knew how. We published the equation to show how fractality causes gravity and all centripetal and negentropic forces. They're negentropic or self-organizing because when the wave converges at that center, tuned to Planck, the key signature, and implode down the pine cone from transverse into longitudinal, only the shareable waves survive. There is a sorting into phase, which is massive and centripetal, meaning that the waves which are out of phase are self-canceled. That self-cancellation process is named negentropy, self-organization. So once you become implosive, it means only pure intention is going to work if it's not a shareable wave. So we understand now why we use the word next dimension to describe ascension. We now understand why we use the word other densities, and we now understand why we use words like rainbow light body and higher being body, because the higher being, it's actually not physically higher, it is more distributed. When you become able to inhabit a larger array, and that electric field you call your aura is more effectively distributed. Remember, it's essentially toroidal, actually it's nested dodeca. As it gets bigger, there are some limitations in that array, and that would be if you try your bliss in a steel and aluminum building, your aura is going to bleed pretty fast. If you try to do it in dead air and electrosmog, so there's some things which practically limit the size of that array, and they're very practical. You know, when the medical doctor had the near-death experience and saw from outside her body, she could not have looked from inside a steel or aluminum box. It don't work. It's called dielectric constant. If dielectric constant means capacitive distribution efficiency, And steel and aluminum is the opposite of what you need. What you need is high dielectric, like barium, strontium, titanate, or even biologic materials. This is the physics of orgone, actually. So sacred architecture is a name for capacitance which distributes efficiently. Practical example. And we've done this many times. Remember when Korotkov followed the Kogi to where they could phone their ancestors? And oh yes, he measured it. It's called fractality in air, charge distribution efficiency. Now we have a technology to measure that life force in sacred space. flameinmind.com/lifeforce. You can study it there. We're just doing a power spectrum of the weak capacitive field of that space, and the same harmonic inclusiveness of that sacred space that predicts heart harmonics, that predicts whether you have an immune system. It's all about harmonic inclusiveness, which is another name for fractality, which is another name for charge distribution efficiency. Short summary, charge distribution efficiency defines sacred space and bliss and ascension because it's the only way waves get around. So when you have implosive efficient fractal compression, then you have implosive radiance, explosive radiance, unpacking, which is, the rose has to pack perfectly before it can unpack. That's very simple. So that ability to get that wave distributing is what we call ascension. Another very practical example, this ability to plasma project this coherent longitudinal bubble of perception, sometimes named remote viewing, astral travel. It's also named lucid dreaming. Now, we're going to give you a very specific, as we've emphasized a few times, example here. We designed a technology, when we're going to show the slides in a minute, to make the electric field that enables lucid dreaming. It's called Therify.net. We take this broad spectral phase conjugation, this broad spectral harmonics, all the way from phase conjugate noble gases to phase conjugate RF modulation to phase conjugate infrasound, and we modulate these two very accurate frequency cascade pine cones exactly 180 degrees out of phase from opposite sides, all the way from optical to RF to infrasound. You got big pine cones kissing noses, accurate at the center. And the more broad spectral, the more nicotropic. Hint, a little further, we go a little further in this path, you've got a Stargate. A little further on this path, you've got time travel. A little further, this is the introduction. So the point is that Therify.net now is a documented, known trigger of lucid dreaming. And as I've emphasized a few times, this is important because lucid dreaming is about the best way to find out if you're going to take memory through death. Lucid dreaming is also a pretty good way to find out if you're going to survive ET parasites. Hint, super soldier talk at YouTube or secret space program. The successful ones are the lucid dreamers. The Aboriginal peoples walk the same song line for 1,000 generations, and then they're lucid dreamers, and then they're bending those song lines with their mind. Talk to an advanced dowser. How does he steer a water vein into his well? He doesn't have to hit the pole with a hammer, no. He steers it with his mind and intent. So after you get centripetal, then you begin to steer that tornado, that vortex, and you get leverage, and you can throw your weight around. So it's all about building the centripetal inertia of that plasma vortex. You can read about the wave mechanics of shamans steering tornadoes, for example, at goldenmean.info/dowsing. Point for our conversation here is that the limitations of this array dynamic is a pretty simple physics. This old story about if you follow an advanced Tibetan saint at the moment of death, it's well documented that rainbows show up. We've shown the physics of the reason color exists is phase conjugate optics, fractalfield.com/fractal photosynthesis, that literally the wavelength ratios between the colors is actually a golden ratio cascade. For example, the two frequencies that make photosynthesis happen are literally phase conjugate optics. Photosynthesis is negentropic because the only two narrow color frequencies that make photosynthesis go are exactly golden ratio to Planck, called phase conjugation. That's the reason photosynthesis exists and the reason it's negentropic. So, why do rainbows show up when Tibetan saints die? Well documented. Because the massive centripetal force you add to your environment electrically at the moment of death. If you're an Aboriginal saint, if you're a Tibetan saint, that's your, that's why the solar flares were affected so dramatically when 1 million children sang the same song. It was measured 11 times. They made something centripetal. So, now let's apply this to what is the more specific topic of this presentation, which is the technology of Ascension. So here's the thing. Have we yet said what Ascension is? Ascension is the process of assembling a coherent bubble of charge around your body, which is centripetal enough where the charge implodes from transverse up and down inertia, which doesn't go very far, into coherent longitudinal waves, which, when tuned to Planck, propagate compressionally, and they can cross at a distance and create the physics of action at a distance. Einstein was wrong to call it spooky. It's called longitudinal interferometry. And this is the physics of gravity waves, as Tom Bearden, my former associate, proved. You can see all that at fractalfield.com/vacuum energy. So, this is a longitudinal array which has to be fractal, dodecacosa, because this is the only place where non-destructive compression nodes exist in a stable form, which is why gravity itself is negentropic, which is why Jodie Foster had to use a dodecahedron in the movie Contact, which was really about her lucid dream. So, what Ascension is assembling that bubble of longitudinal coherence around your body, the Ba from the Ka, the Kesjan body, the rainbow light body. Lots of words, but where's the physics? Here's the physics. That longitudinal bubble of compression becomes plasma projectable. The only definition, the real definition of the word shaman or Kesjan body or Jedi. A Jed in Egypt was this tower which used golden ratio for plasma projection. And Luke Skywalker was a Jedi after he learned to plasma project. So, this is truly the physics of Ascension, is the assembling of this coherent longitudinal bubble around your body, which is exactly what we do by charging centripetally massively the aura with the plasma at therify.net, which we now know dramatically can help trigger lucid dreaming. Also is helpful for releasing ghosts, and we know why, because the ghosts needs the centripetal force to enter into the charge distribution named ancestral memory, or the collective unconscious, or the communion of saints. So that longitudinal nodal grid, which is the physics of DNA radio, is the song line, the dreaming track, the ancestral memory. It's this array of waves bouncing coherently longitudinally from node to node, which is why ancestors' phone calls were only possible at places where air was fractal, where charge distribution efficiency is enabled, and why the cozy red mirrors worked only where the magnetic lines cross, and the same longitudinal nodes where the Earth grid dodecacosa magnetic lines cross. Bruce Cathy documented dramatically decreased nuclear critical mass, because capacitive implosion is the way you contain radioactivity, the physics of the Ark of the Covenant. So this ability to embed in this array, in physics the sexy term to use today is entanglement. We now know that the perfection of entanglement is called perfected embedding, and the perfected embedding is the problem solved by perfected golden ratio fractality, harmonics of golden ratio to Planck. So entanglement perfected is exactly what we've now defined the physics of by equation, golden ratio exponents of Planck. So when, for example, in physics they talked about these Einstein-Rosen bridges, They already predicted that there would be wormholes to connect, but they didn't predict the frequency signature and how to build them. I've just informed you exactly electrically how you build a Stargate, if you understood what I just said. Practical example, if you take the tetracube symmetry of the vortex, you take the self-organizing vortex and the self-organizing 7-color map, and you look at the shadows indexed by the tetra, that's called Hebrew and Sanskrit, goldenmean.info/DNA ring. Now, if you take the superset of that, which is a hypercube superset of the tetracube, then those vortex sacred letters are called Ophanim Enochian, angel language. And that hypercube, then, the superset, which is basically a dodeca, symmetry of the plasma vortex of the tetra is the way they made the movie Stargate. Do you get it? They took those letters from Ophanim Enochian, the way that John D. and Kelly learned the alphabet of angel language. It's the physics of angels, because it's the plasma physics of how angels build their bodies. Holographics, goldenmean.info/Ophanim. Point being, they took exactly those plasma residue shadows of the hypercube, named Ophanim Enochian alpha, and put this on this thing called the movie Stargate. Well, what are they doing? They're steering plasma into an implosive hypercube. Next dimension, dodecaecosa superset of tetracube. And that's called a Stargate because how do you keep your attention at that central focus? Well, there's some rules about that. So, you now know exactly, as I, an electrical engineer, do what Ascension is. It is the ability to build that coherent bubble of charge in your aura, a longitudinal array, which you can take with you if you hold the center in the focus of your attention. And every time you think pure principle over shareable thought, or something that serves the whole, you gain centripetal force. That's why pure intention is electrically measurable in heart coherence. Study that at realheartcoherence.com. Actual second-order power spectrum measurement of your EKG. I invented the concept and the word heart coherence because I invented the measurement, realheartcoherence.com, and it's a functional lie detector. It works great. It's also functional to measure kinesiology, the lie detector of your body, because that is a shareable wave, and biology knows which waves are shareable because it knows what waves have store the pure principle that serves all life. And every time you get on board with that pure principle of implosion, you distilled your day into pure principle. You're ready to die or you're ready for bliss. It's the same, because you've built all of your memories into a shareable wave. No secrets required. It's the opposite of secrets, which is exactly what death physics requires, that implosion. So that ability to sort waves into which ones are perfectly shareable at the implosive center is a lie detector. That's what your heart knows. The old joke, that's why you don't buy a used car from a salesman with shifty eyes, because, in fact, if you can focus, if you can hold that wave to stillness, the still point maintenance itself is the definition of pure intention. In other words, if he can hold your focus, then he has the awareness to hold the pure principle of a wave that's absolutely shareable, and therefore the physics of pure intention. And that ability to access that still point is the lightning core physics of Kundalini itself, which feels like lightening up your tailbone for exactly that reason. You see all the harmonics at goldenmean.info/Kundalini. So, you know what Ascension is. I've just outlined it very, very clearly to build that coherence charge bubble in your longitudinal bubble. The technology of Ascension is basically anything that helps you build that implosive field. Now, well, yes, this could be a shameless plug here. Therify.net can help you build that aura. That's plasma, it's helpful, and 30% of people experience a sharpening of vision in Therify, and 30% of people experience some form of euphoria or bliss if they're relaxed and they, But, obviously, a sacred stone circle can do almost as good, or a well-built cathedral. Each of those things, Therify, a well-built theory, there was this Therify, or a sacred stone circle, or an ancient druid oak forest. Each of those devices, which is our technology for ascension, can be identified as technology for ascension by the frequency signature. You take the harmonic analysis of a perfectly happy tree, you get the same harmonic cascade that defines brainwaves for bliss, flameinmind.com, that defines therify.net. It's all the same frequency signature. So the technology for ascension is anything that helps you make that implosion sustainable and centripetal. And of course, we have certain offerings here. Flameinmind.com teaches that in brain waves, or you can buy a very inexpensive version, which is the Flame and Sound, which is just the binaural beat audio, which is the world's most powerful bliss-inducing binaural audio. So there's the brainwave, the audio version, is technology for ascension. There's the therify.net, which is a plasma, very broad spectrum. We have the imploder.com. Now these are just simple examples of centripetal force which you can harness to build that implosion. But obviously, you don't need a gadget every day. What you need is to understand the principle to do it yourself, which is going to mean probably you spend more time in sacred space where charge is available, living air, living architecture, charge implosion is there, fresh air, and you step away from the electrosmog. You get to a place where you call it a sacred space, your place of power, as Kassan. So that's one thing, and then you learn charge-dense food, and you learn to think thoughts which are shareable, and you learn to charge-dense yoga, ability to accrete capacitance, otherwise known as the quality of grace. So if the yoga move is actually good physics, then you'll feel a tingle in your fingertip. They call it chi, and you've imploded capacitance. So you're learning all these ways to implode charge to gather this bubble. And this is all a technology of ascension. But it's a very simple principle behind it. It doesn't require mysticism. It doesn't require religion. It really requires embracing some of the science. So, now next issue would be either some questions or a slideshow. Let me see if I have the chat window here. Somebody said, chills up their spine. It's a travesty that science has come to know something. Yes, that's right, I agree. It is a travesty that science has come to be known as something limited to materialism. Exactly. When spiritual people say, well, don't talk physics to me because that's not spiritual. That's the opposite is actually true. That when we understand that spirituality was simply a name for the charge propagation enabled by implosion, suddenly there is nothing more inspiring and spiritual and mystical than physics itself, because all you're doing is riding a pure wave. Or when somebody says, well, one day you were talking sacred geometry and next day you were talking physics, and I say, sacred geometry was only a way to introduce the pure wave mechanics of pure implosion, the perfection of physics. So, okay, so that I see those were the questions. So let me just go ahead now and click on share screen, and we'll just try to...
Hey Dan, it's Jonathan. We have a question here in person.
Okay.
So we've been doing some research using ultra high frequency handheld radio receivers that are on the same channel, but we're getting different sounds coming from each one. And we can put them in a Faraday cage, it still works. We get 20 of them together, and they're still producing different sounds. So it seems like maybe we could be accessing the longitudinal wave that you're talking about and communicating between dimensions. What do you think?
Well, I'm not sure I understand your question exactly, but let me give an example. When our good friend Sam Osmanagich at the Bosnian Pyramid, he's pioneered the research there, was seeing that people were coming from all over the world into his pyramid because they were getting rejuvenation experiences. They were healing massively. And so he took a low-frequency sound power spectra, the infrasound harmonic, and later we did a lot of work on this, and we found that the sound harmonic series that creates rejuvenation is charge implosion, literally implosion sound. Now you can read all that data at fractalfield.com/implosion sound and also at flameinmind.com/flameinsound. So it is true that the perfected heterodyne cascade of perfected implosion is negentropic, healing, self-organizing. For example, the reason 50 hertz is the only way carbon can grow and it won't happen in 60, and 50 hertz is the most common frequency mentioned in all cancer healing literature, is because 50 hertz is perfect golden ratio to Planck, and 60 ain't. It's called the Tesla mistake. So that is an example of getting the frequency right to complete the cascade. So for example, if you were using ultrasound or high frequencies, you could actually take my equation, Planck times golden ratio, integer exponents of golden ratio, and you calculate the ultrasonic frequencies necessary to perfect implosion through Planck, and when you tune it to Planck, which was my discovery, that's when you enable longitudinal coherent propagation. For example, you can design the correct infrared frequencies for infrared saunas to heal. You can design the right implosion sound to make the perfected bliss binaural beats, etc., etc. So, but I would caution you that, well, let me just give you one more example here. We then built an implosion sound generator, which was a mechanical way to make a speaker make implosion sound powerfully. And we actually offered the software for a while. And sometimes when you have a purely mechanical way of generating implosion, it actually can be painful. And there's a reason for that, because suddenly you got all this memory imploding through Planck from a purely mechanical source, and you're not adding anything to DNA radio's collective survival library, and your aura is saying, ooh. Now, we took those exact same frequencies, golden ratio times Planck, and we taught 4 or 5 different parts of a human choir to make precise implosion sound. And there was never, ever anything so blissful. It was incredible. So what I'm saying is, yes, you can make implosion sound mechanically, but when you combine that with living intention, then therein lies the magic. Oh, with hemoglobin, harness energy from sunlight is chlorophyll. Yes, yes, exactly. In fact, thank you. I think that was Axel. Yes, Axel. That Axel is pointing out the connection between hemoglobin and chlorophyll. You know, there's only, you just plug and unplug I think it was what was it? I think a magnesium atom. You plug and unplug a magnesium atom, and then chlorophyll is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is chlorophyll. It's just very symmetrically close. And we know that the harmonic cascade through center that enables that process is tuned optically phase conjugate to Planck, exactly like photosynthesis is. So yes, that's why photosynthesis, what started outside your body, remember originally most blood was green. People that have long memory know that. And blood only turned red, you know, chlorophyll to hemoglobin, after they were forced underground. It's part of the ET story. It's a bit long story. But the point was, the chlorophyll turned to hemoglobin because, you know, they were stuck underground. And but it's the same physics. It's phase conjugate implosion. And yes, absolutely, that would be healing. In fact, that generalized principle is called fusion in the blood, and it's the physics, and I mean the physics, which differentiates ensoulment from the AI problem in the galaxy. So in fact, if you understand fusion in the blood, simple, brainwave harmonics, heart harmonics cascading, the trance bliss process, you measure that phonon, implode recursively, braids the DNA, and that implosion is called fusion in the blood, the only real physics of bliss, and we measure the effect on DNA of human bliss, heart coherence, you can see all that, the DNA manifesto. Point being, that fusion in the blood is exactly the climax function of a hemoglobin chlorophyll to make the phase conjugate implosion electric field much bigger around the blood during bliss, which ultimately is, you know, may the force be with you, Luke, and And you know how kids learn to see without their eyes. You know, step number one is imagine you're in beautiful nature and your body flips an electrical switch and you get fractal. You start imploding, and then suddenly this vortex happens inside and you're seeing without your eyes. Why Luke Skywalker had to go to nature before became a Jedi, literally the eye of the Jed. So ideally we'd have to implode our aura to then have it expand back to its size, if not bigger. Exactly. In other words, you get centripetal first. Implosion precedes radiance. So, you know, when St. Francis went down to the woods to pray, and the town villagers called the fire department because they saw his plasma from a distance. True story. How did his aura get so big? It started by getting centripetal. Absolutely. Okay, so then we were going to just play with a little slideshow here. Let's see if we get that far. This is a shared desktop function, and then we're going to click on the keynote here, and hopefully now you're beginning to see. Are you seeing my desktop? I hope. Let's see if we move this over here. I wonder if I can move
we see your keynote there.
Oh, good. Thank you. So, the subject here, remember, the physics of ascension is fractal implosion in the aura. The longitudinal coherence is the rainbow body. It's called rainbow because it becomes spectrally differentiated into the rainbow phase conjugate physics. The reason rainbow exists because it's longitudinally coherent. This is simultaneously with all of the physics of bliss process. We made a beautiful new film on the Kundalini physics of bliss. You can see it at goldenmean.info/Kundalini, and that's where all these following slides come from, where we see the same golden ratio harmonics in brain waves, heart harmonics, etc., etc. So, explains how implosion in plasma heals, verified at net, explains why conscious focus compresses charge. Remember, you now know what the physics of consciousness is. It is absolutely not your brain. It is absolutely the plasma vortex that forms inside your brain if the net of fireflies, the synaptic net array, becomes fractal and implosive. And that so well defines, for the first time, any physics of consciousness conversation on this planet has ever answered the two most important questions. Why is it that focused human attention causes charge to compress? It's been measured a dozen times, Bill Tiller. So somebody's got to account for that. Two, it also happens to reduce radioactivity measurably. Did you know that? Hint, Uri Geller. And the other point was that the ability of attention to exist outside your head. Somebody has to describe a physics of consciousness that explains why you can take your eyeballs outside your head, whether you call it lucid dreaming, remote viewing, astral projection, etc., etc. Actually, the reason is because that plasma vortex tornado itself is consciousness. Hello? It's a plasma tornado. That's what consciousness is. And of course you can take it outside your body, and you need to know how to build that tornado to make eyeballs. So there's a physics of consciousness for you. And anybody else that says they have a physics of consciousness theory, I dare them to explain why focused attention is centripetal electrically and how you take vision outside your head. I just have, and I think it's important that we agree on something. Okay. Yeah, so where vision occurs outside your body, and then on the slide, how blindfolded kids start seeing without the eyes through a vortex, which is why imploding EEG frequencies, all in golden ratio alpha beta, cause inner vision and bliss, why death visions, the Clouvet geometric sequence, is braid implosive. The geometric sequence you see at death obeys this physics. It's a black hole that enables successful death, the same way a black hole enables successful lucid dreaming, because it enables successful, coherent, longitudinal interferometry plasma projection. It explains how and why death visions are electrically contagious. It explains why a cold spot measure indicates where ghosts. It also explains where ghosts need to go in order to be released. Hint, verified. Right, why ghosts require sacred space. Korotkov measured where ghosts go after death and why and when, and it all fits this physics. It also explains why ball lightning is measurably responsive to telepathy. Now let's see if I can make my little slideshow talk to us here. Next slide. Here we go. Move this over. Okay. So we're identifying bliss and kundalini in general as the physics of this frequency signature. The bliss and kundalini and charged radiance, which is the climax form of ascension, is identified always by the same frequency signature in A, brainwaves, B, sacrocranial low-frequency spine liquid pump harmonics, C, breath harmonics, D, heart rate variability harmonics, E, binaural beat bliss audio harmonics, F, plasma implosion harmonics, G, the charge harmonics for sacred space, the definition of sacred space, life force in architecture. All of the above frequency signatures for bliss will then be golden ratio times Planck. Thus, not only have we identified how bliss transcendence propagates, but we've identified how to optimize it. So this is the original slide, and this just shows if you take Planck times golden ratio integer exponents, you get 3 exact radiative hydrogen, you get ADP, the 1.93 angstrom, the exact most important molecule in cell metabolism. You get the exact 2 wavelengths, purple and orange, that make photosynthesis happen. You get the definition of sacred dimension, the British foot, and also the definition of sacred dimension, and we'll talk about that in the history of architecture. You get the Schumann harmonics, the brainwave harmonics. You get the LF component Mayer wave in the blood, 0.1 hertz. You get the Venus year, Earth year, galactic year, and precession year. So basically this, on that line, is the origin of biological negentropy, the title of my book, because that is the only path of chaos, and the proof that your physics teacher was wrong when he said the universe is condemned to entropy. Wrong. There is a way out. There's a way out of chaos, and that's it. So, and then if you want to see the publications we've made of the equations to prove this, at fractalfield.com/vacuum energy, you'll see here we publicize the generalized wave equations proving constructive wave interference, thus proving how hydrogen is fractal and how gravity is caused by phase conjugation to Planck. So this is the visual. There it is. There's your perfect caduceus. There's the implosion of perfect fractal nest of pentadecahedron. Many of you have seen these slides before. Perfect implosion. I say here, the intelligence that takes fear that golden ratio is the solution to constructive wave interference is right up there with the smarts it takes to know that the correct shape to make a wheel is a circle. The reason golden ratio defined beauty was because it defined perfect compression, perfect fractality. So basically it allows the donuts to implode. This is the slide that explains, and you've seen these before, but see, when the vortex is perfect, side view, caduceus, golden ratio spiral down the perfect vortex, transverse wave enters at the right, and a longitudinal wave leaves at, transverse enters at the left, up and down, and the longitudinal wave emerges at the right at the toothpaste tube orifice called Planck length. And when you squeeze, implode the toothpaste, which in this case is electrical charge, the physics of the ether, the longitudinal wave tuned to Planck then is traveling compressionally on the right-hand side, and that allows action at a distance and is the physics of gravity and the collective unconscious. So understanding longitudinal EMF, efficient energy charge distribution, perfected wave distribution, that the fractal conjugate wave array is actually how you're born into a higher being body. You inhabit an array.
Boring to you? Sorry. I can switch.
So this is pictures of the Tesla's wireless power transmission tower, and just we've said many times that the reason Tesla did not succeed in creating power distribution without wires is he used the wrong frequency signature, and he didn't understand where the nodes were in the longitudinal array to enable power distribution without wires efficiently. Unlike the builders of the pyramids, which we now know were they called them the Hummer, the piezoelectric low frequencies of the Schumann harmonics implode capacitive pyramid, and it propagates the resultant longitudinal power distribution array around the Earth at the nodes, which is why the pyramids are at dodecaecosa nodes, which apparently Tesla didn't figure out. And we talk about some of, we're admiring Einstein and Tesla in general. We're just saying that there are some key mistakes which unfortunately had long-term repercussions for our civilization. When Tesla chose 60 cycle, the frequency at which the voltage required to stop the heart is lowest, he actually chose an anti-biologic frequency. And by the way, in the process, prevented the United States from ever growing carbon nano, the most important tech on the planet, because it can only grow in 50 hertz. Welcome to Europe. So this is just a little animation that you see what a transverse wave looks like. So the direction of wave motion up and down is perpendicular to the direction of propagation, unlike a longitudinal wave at the bottom, where the direction of the compression wave is parallel to the direction of propagation. Unfortunately, electrical engineers have very little knowledge of how to manipulate longitudinal EMF. In fact, only one radio engineer in a million, if you ask him how do you build a longitudinal antenna, will know the answer to the question. In fact, that is the answer to the efficient production of hydrogen, by the way. Kansas knew. So when these longitudinal waves converge in four-wave mixing, where phase conjugation was discovered, the vortex will form perfectly at center. This, by the way, is also how you make lasers phase conjugate. And there the transverse and longitudinal components interact again, and you can resynthesize and contain heat at a distance. This is the only answer to plasma heat containment, the holy grail of every fusion research lab on this planet. If they don't know what longitudinal RF interferometry is, then they're wasting your money. So this is why actually there's three pairs of primary colors, because if you view those vortex in the cube from the hex view of that cube, you have three perfect pairs of vortex. Introduction to the physics of the phase conjugate cause of color, although this, I think we animate some of that here. So the way the vortex inhabits the dodeca, and that same hex view of that vortex down below, if you see the golden ratio on those pine cones, that's literally a map of how you make lasers phase conjugate. And thus, here's the picture in phase conjugate optics, how you make negentropy and time reversal in phase conjugate optics. You have to make the lasers meet in a four-wave mixing, and then the bounce wave goes backwards in time. When they say it goes backwards in time, they actually simply mean becomes negentropic. So this is from flameinmind.com. This is one of my early bliss experiences, and here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 brainwave harmonics, beta, alpha, theta, delta, an exactly golden mean ratio. And so this is an implosive cascading brainwaves, and a little bit more animated here. I think we have, yeah, maybe this one's animated. So you see actually the evolution of, you'll see the alpha in green toward the bottom, and then the massive yellow theta. It happens with my kundalini that I happen to have massive theta in yellow, you see there. And so when you're teaching people to have bliss and transcendence or to ascend, essentially what you're teaching them is to make this cascade happen implosively. And the actual ratio of the alpha to beta here indicates when the frequencies are cascading by golden ratio. And just to make the point, from, again, flameinmind.com/outervision, here, the hero of our Seeing Without the Eyes work, when she goes into a form of trance, super relaxation, you see this is her alpha in green, and then in blue here, you have the golden ratio brainwave harmonics leading up to gamma at the top, and in pink, you have the octave harmonics. So we have a cascade of both golden ratio and octave harmonics all the way from alpha all the way to gamma, 40 hertz, 80 hertz, and higher. And that cascade identifies the moment when the child sees this vortex inside their head and is able to see through that tunnel inside their head and begins to see without their eyes. And remember, there's a discipline of relaxation, a form of trance required, and the children learn how to do it much more easily than adults. So here we talked about wireless transmission, we talked about phase conjugate implosion, cause of bliss. Yeah, and here we're also mentioning about Gaia. The reason, the Lovelock proved that Gaia, Earth, is negentropic. That's proven. That's been done. But why? That's what I have explained. You'll see the picture here. The Schumann harmonics very closely approximate golden ratio to Planck. And that is a caduceus cascade, which is the reason the low frequencies of Earth make her approach self-organization, negentropy. Point I'm making is that's tunable. You can repair the rain, repair the weather. You tune the environment to more negentropy. This is an example in the physics of rebirthing that if you actually take the perfect birth canal, the implosive squeeze of the perfect birth actually is at a moment of golden ratio with respect to the length of the birth canal. If the max pressure is golden ratio in the birth canal, that implosion moment should be the physics of why birth is blissful, and even more importantly, the physics of how you bring memory through birth. So children that are born underwater, for example, have higher IQ rates dramatically, in part simply because this curve here of change in pressure over time in the birth canal is more contiguous at the end, and the rate of decompression of the skull is made more contiguous, and therefore contiguous decompression is the physics of bringing memory through birth. So if you made the unpacking of the skull more curvilinear and less sharp change, which is why sacrocranial practitioners adjust the infant's skull bone geometries. This is just talking about, when you look at this ghost leaving the body, and Korotkov measured where the ghost goes and why. We talked about that sacred space and needs compression. But this ghost is visible mostly because the forest is there. Hint, this photograph will not happen in a hospital. Hint, if you want to take something with you when you die, most hospitals are called hell for a reason electrically, because the electrosmog and bad air there mean that the plasma cocoon can't propagate. Hello, sacred space required. Birth and death and bliss have the same physics. This is Korotkov measuring 10 and 36 hours, confirming the Tibetans the number of hours it takes for the aura to leave the body after death, and here he's measuring where the aura goes after death and why. Here's from Sacred Mirrors, thank you, and the pine cone compression experience of death. And here is the Heinrich Kluwe form constants, which is the map you will see when you die. And again, we want to thank Danny Schreiber for coming back from death to tell us that there was a sound, infrasound component to these geometries during his death, which identifies further the nature of the electrical implosion required for successful death, because that's how you insert yourself into the collective unconscious. And this is why you see what you see when you die, lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral, because the DNA has to do this braid implosion thing in order to get you compressed enough, which is why don't try death or bliss if you're angry, because that ain't a shareable wave. And this is the definition of sacred space in architecture, the place where ghosts go at death. Sacred space is the place of charge implosion, because that's the place where charge distribution is enabled. This is how that fractality in air causes seeds to grow measurably. Therify.net is famous. In fact, that biodynamics has just learned you zap the seeds with Therify implosive plasma, like 300% growth effect, especially in marijuana. So this is the difference between a hospital and sacred space. It is simply charge distribution efficiency. All this is in our biologic architecture curriculum, goldenmean.info/architecture. Some of you have seen these pictures before. But here, at that place, we show the 3 different ways to measure life force in a building to determine which architect should get paid, because this tells you by measurement in advance which building will cause a seed or a child to grow. So here is this on the right here. This is Korotkov's technique for measuring life force in sacred space. It's basically a metal titanium cylinder measuring the ability of a spark to propagate. The reason that measures sacred space is because it measures whether a spark has someplace to go. Hint, your soul. So if you're in a sacred space, it looks like this. If you're in a dead aluminum building, this is a metal barn, the spark has no place to go. Hint, your aura. So if the spark is trapped, so is the soul of your kid. So do not send them to a metal school building, please. So he called this fractality in air and later proved this is where the code geeks go to make phone calls to ancestors. And we totally agreed now that my technology, which takes the weak power spectra of the sacred space, and we just measure the harmonic content of the capacitance of the air for harmonic inclusiveness, and we can tell you also whether sacred space is sacred. And we're offering that technology now at flameinmind.com/lifeforce. You can find out which tree is going to live or die by whether the same Schumann harmonic cascade is there, etc. So this is a predictor for which seed is going to grow. For example, the primary function of many of the early pyramids was simply to treat seeds to grow, as now why Therify.net is used for plasma treatment in biodynamics, for example. Zap the seeds. Hello. And this explains why African architecture is profoundly fractal. So examples of commercial success using basically technology of Ascension, technology of Implosion, are Therify.net, theimploder.com, flameinmind.com, iThrive.com, and look out for our carbon nano and energy tech coming soon. Here is the imploder.com. This is the new ultra imploder. We take that vortex implosion and it puts a life force, centripetal force into the water with supermagnetics and implosive vortex. This is that vortex by design. I took my equation, which is now proven to be the radii structure of hydrogen, and I made the perfect implosive vortex called Schauberger's dream. And if that water entering is even slightly piezo, that means hard water, seeds growing next to the water vortex will grow faster even if they don't get the water. You get the physics here? Access to charge implosion. So here's the Therify.net. This is a technology that's absolutely taken off. I'm so grateful here when this slide was made. It was 15 countries, now it's 25 countries. And so we're doing rejuvenation, pain reduction, et cetera, et cetera. Don't make medical claims, but obviously you charge the aura massively with centripetal force, and the results are incredible, off the charts. We can deal with pain, for example, localized pain, in usually one session, one or two. And long-term or chronic pain, we can help many, not all. We don't make medical claims, but you'll see there by the reports in the Therify blog that indeed we're achieving incredible results in just all kinds of health issues simply by charging the aura massively, centripetally, and broad spectrally. This is the history of Therify.net. It started with Antoine Prieuré, who healed thousands of cancers in France, famously spending millions of dollars on each device. And we discovered here are the frequencies he used, 3, 10, 32, and 80. The day we figured out that these frequencies from Prieuré, which he got from Rife and Lakhovsky and Tesla, actually were crude approximations of my equation. That was the day we figured out the physics behind Prieuré was phase conjugation. Remember, he didn't know what phase conjugation was and didn't know he needed to use opposing pairs and didn't know how to perfect the frequency cascade. Once we knew that my equation was the predictor, then we built the perfect infrasound, the perfect RF, and the perfect phase conjugate noble gas, and we built the Therify. So you see how the implosive cascade works. And even famously, Prieuré was achieving incredible effects on plant growth as well, for the same reason that the largest biodynamic science group in France just bought the Therify just for agriculture. So here this is, these measurements of the effect on the aura of Therify. Here's the actual frequency series used in perfected binaural bliss beat frequency binaural sound bliss from flameinmind.com, which by the way now can be used to drive Quantify, can be used to drive 5vibes.com, and can be used to drive plasmafire.com, the same implosive sound. This is just an example of if you say Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. No, if you say A, E, I, O, U, here's A, E, O, So I've said and I've made a caduceus. So do you see why the central still point at the end of a properly pronounced Om is in fact implosive? That's the three-dimensional power spectrum. Here, so I mentioned about the Schumann harmonics are at bottom in green. Sorry it's so small. 3 Hz, 7.83, 14.3, 20.8. The known documented Schumann harmonics in green at the bottom. And here is my equation on top. 2.78, 4.5, 7.2, 11.8, 19.9. So the perfected Schumann harmonics, if we want to make the planet even more negentropic, we just have to do minor tweaking to the Schumann harmonic cascade and build our Stargate. Here at the top, you see this is the only two frequencies that make photosynthesis happen, the purple and orange. It just happens those are exactly golden ratio to Planck. So phase conjugation is the reason photosynthesis exists. You can read all about that at fractalfield.com/fractal photosynthesis. More about the physics of color, and to understand that color only exists because of phase conjugation. Where's my donut? Photon travels as a torus. The only reason you have a cone in your eye to measure color is the only thing you use a cone for in antenna theory is to measure phase angle of that torus photon. So the visible spectrum is 180 degrees from 350 to 700 nanometers, and the angle of that 180 degree tilt of the photon, called the color spectrum, turns out to be 90 degrees is green, but the only angle are the platonic angles. So you have 45, 90, 135 for purple, green, orange. So the only two colors that are not a cubic angle for the photon, the tilt of that photon, which you name color, is only the tilt of the photon. And the tilt of the photons you call yellow and blue are 117 and 63 degrees. Guess what that angle is? That's the inside and outside angle of a dodecahedron. Proof that phase conjugation is the reason color exists. And we just did some more animations here. This is called the Holy Grail. You see why that Holy Grail of three-dimensional fractality is in fact literally that embedding of that golden ratio pine cone. And this is the perfect flame in mind. And you see the size of those sine waves as golden ratio, which makes the perfect flame, literally. And if you rotate that pine cone further, you see the physics of the swastika is actually simply charge rotation perfected, is literally charge implosion mapped. That is the Holy Grail, and that's what the swastika is. It's a sacred symbol because it's implosive. This is from our team. We thank Amar in Brazil, who called us for help making rain when the fires were approaching, and taught the kids how to do this with us, and had such rainstorms that 2 days after half the towns were dying because of the fires were coming. 2 days later they called us, please help stop the rain. You can read all about that at goldenmean.info/rain, and this is the teacher explaining how she taught the kids to make rain. Literally make a centripetal force, the physics of precipitation, literally Christos. And that's why the cone that was most effective in making rain in Trevor Constable's weather engineering on high seas is actually a 6-degree implosion cone capacitively. This is from Contact here. Just wanted to show you here, so we're mapping the Schumann harmonics and the brainwave harmonics to the identical same infrasound cascade. This is what we've been talking about through the whole conversation. The brainwave harmonics that make bliss and the perfected Schumann harmonics and the perfected phase conjugation are all the same. What does that mean? Okay, now I'm going to click escape here, and I'm going to click stop the screen share. I see that we're running out of time here, and wanted to ask if there were any questions as we finish. There's more slides. Most of that slideshow is available at fractalfield.com/vacuum-energy. But let's just ask the question, have we said what the technology of Ascension is? I emphasize to you that we've made a whole series of films now on how humans may emerge from parasitic extraterrestrials. And the short summary is simple. Build a lucid dreaming bliss body, and then you're different than the Greys and the Dracos and the AI. Otherwise, you're a cog in a Borg machine. So it is more than a theoretical question, what is the technology of ascension? The same question is, how are our children going to continue to have a soul if we continue to not know what that is? Thank you very much. Any final questions? That,
Yes, one question coming in here, Dan, from our side.
sure. Go ahead.
You said that hemoglobin came from chlorophyll, and does that mean that we shouldn't be putting the DNA and the RNA of animals into our body because we don't have a function to read that, and that we should just be using plant DNA and RNA if we were originally had chlorophyll, like blood?
Well, the mythic story is that the early blood, sort of quote-unquote pre-Lemurian, was green blood. You know, Enki Osiris, every face is green. Guess what? He was a green frog. And then they were forced underground for many millennia, and the blood turned red. Probably why the hemoglobin and the chlorophyll molecule are virtually identical, except one little plug in the middle. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that we're not designed to be able to digest both hemoglobin and chlorophyll. Of course we're designed. But there is a level of awareness that is involved. So shamanically, I think my partner Valerie is actually right, that if you're going to eat an animal, a shaman knows that you must pay the debt of the memory that you consumed in honor, because there is a debt, you know. But so if you eat a small animal, there's less karma than eating a big animal. It doesn't mean you shouldn't eat it either. But as long as you're aware that there's a price to pay to the universe to return the entropy that was in a negentropy that was invested in that animal. So the shaman has a lucid dream the night before and knows which fist they're going to meet next day to catch, because they made a lucid dreaming agreement, and I'm going to consume your memory because we're going to commune. You know, this is a bliss experience. Eating you is blissful. Well, actually, it could be. So there's a lot to understand. All life must eat and be eaten, but to understand how life is invested is the Sufi story about we repay the debt of our existence with each meal. So I don't know if that answered your question, but we did that Sufi expression in our Gurdjieff school.
Thank you, Dan. We have another question.
So I've heard that Drungalo Melchizedek, when he goes into a Markov field and with other people, it can be measured electronically through, like that it has been measured electronically. You're also implying that when we go into that field, we get more right access to the experience that we're all having. But you're also saying that if you have negative intentions, you don't even get that. You don't even get to that. You can't even get to that lucid dreaming right access. If we join together in the world right now to train ourselves to get into these states with our love, we essentially overpower the narrative, right?
It's a beautiful and thoughtful question. Thank you. You know, I taught with Merkaba people around the world for many years myself. What we ended up teaching was that a tetracubic visualization is a beautiful way to incubate your aura. However, and this was always the mysterious last step that Drinville wasn't quite ready to teach, but the fact is that what we found was that people who did the tetracubic visualization and then did not continue eventually had a problem with astral parasites, large scale, actually, unfortunately. So that secret, quote-unquote, last step is actually the physics of what I just demonstrated, that if you take that tetracube and you do the chin angle of the Sphinx, which is 32 degrees, which is how you tip a tetracube up and rotate and blink 5 times and have exactly a pentodeca. But before you do that, you must be sure that you are a shareable wave, otherwise you will be spaced out and get dizzy and you won't come back. That was the warning. So it was a double-edged sword. If you do go from hex to pent at the end, then you first make the golden ratio when you go to pent, and you first implode when you go to pent, and you first have bliss when you go to pent. But by the way, if you tried to go there without having sorted your memories, then you would get spaced out. You become fractionated. So you would approach the pent exactly the same way you'd have to approach bliss and death, which is to say, is every memory of my day perfectly shareable? At that point, then you can visualize the pent accurately, and you're ready for bliss and birth and death, and then you can go from hex to pent. And that's the point, the first point, only when you will actually burn out the parasites. Because, remember, the implosion forces all waves to center and to be sorted into phase, and any wave that is not shareable doesn't survive that flame. So the flame of bliss clearly requires pent, the first time golden ratio, which you will never ever get from a tetracube, and that does show up in the power spectrum where the brainwaves go from octaves to golden ratio. So yes, it's measurable, but absolutely requires going from hex to pent at the climax when you're ready to be a shareable wave. And there's a limit to that, because even if you use golden ratio audio harmonics to trigger that, it can drive you right out of your head, and if you're not ready to go. So there's a preparation required for bliss and death.
Yeah, another question here, Deb.
Did I hear you say that photosynthesis was in trouble or something? That wasn't when you were talking about photosynthesis. And if that's so, what were you talking about?
No, I was saying it's a very narrow notch of wavelength color, purple and orange. Only two very narrow frequencies make photosynthesis happen. The rest of the frequencies of color of light prevent photosynthesis. For example, green actively prevents photosynthesis. That's why every plant is green, because that photon has got to spit out. It cannot be compressed, called negative green. So photosynthesis is actually tunable. That means that you can make the harmonics to make photosynthesis more phase conjugate, fractal, and implosive. For example, infrared, if you're making your LEDs for artificial lighting, now we know exactly why photosynthesis happens, because you got a phase conjugate to Planck, and that's where the inertia photosynthesis is designed to make creates life. So once you know that photosynthesis is caused by fractal phase conjugation accurately tuned to Planck, then you can perfect photosynthesis. That's what I'm saying. Here, one practical example. The reason the wrong color spectrum of light, for example, pink light and most fluorescent lights, actively prevents attention span in the classroom, and you put the right frequency of light, it's called Health and Light by John Ott. You take out those damn wrong frequency fluorescents and you install the right frequencies that actively emanate sunlight, which is phase conjugate, and you create attention. Attention has a frequency recipe. Once our schools know that, they'll know what sound to use and what light to use and what capacitance to use, what dimensions to use. Attention has a frequency signature, and it's known.
Here. Okay, another question coming in here.
Dan, you said that putting charge on seeds helps them grow bigger plants, etc. I believe that's called the Zebner effect. I mean, there was a patent on that by Siva Geigy some decades ago. What I'd like to know is, since the Earth is in such apparent decline with from certain technology that's inappropriate, whether we can resuscitate our seed banks using this method.
Yeah, seed banks absolutely need to know how to make the electric field to cause a seed to grow. They must learn, and Therify.net is just one wonderful example. I give you a very practical thing. Once they determined that almost every sacred ancient stone site on the planet, including pyramid, was never used as a grave. No, what did they use it for? The most common use was to zap the seeds. You take the Therify or the good stone circle and you zap the seeds for even a few minutes, you get like 10 to 100% increase in seed growth. It is dramatic. And it's simple to understand the physics. Look, the difference between a live seed and a dead seed is the ability to attract the first nutrient. You know what that is? That really sucks. It implodes. That's how it got the first nutrient in. So if the seed is not centripetal, it's over.
Dan, looks like there's a few questions in the chat here. Any that you would like to, okay, so where are we here?
Oh, how exactly does one sort their memories before imploding, going from hex to pent? Sort, yes. How exactly do you sort? Well, basically, you know that old exercise, if you can close your eyes at night and play your day like it was a movie and not interrupt, it meant that you had digested each emotion, which meant that you had distilled every experience to pure principle, which is exactly the compression process that enables bliss or death. So basically, as you experience every experience in your life distilled to pure principle, suddenly there's nothing to be angry about because everything was shareable. Everything is about pure principle.
Another question here.
Hey Dan, it's Mitch Feinstein. I want to thank you for your great work. We have a Therapy, and I'm confused. I know there's a quantifier. So the Therapy is based on hydrogen. Is there a way to hook in a frequency input to do multiple frequencies with the Therapy as we have designed with the quantifier?
Both devices, the Therapy is programmed with the precise cascade for perfect implosion at much, much, much higher power. Because there is some risk of destructive interferometry for external modulation if it's over a certain critical threshold, it requires a modification for external input, which you can discuss with Paul, is optional on Therapy. Conversely, for Quantify, which at therapy.net/quantify, the Quantify is much, much, much lower power and much cheaper, but is built for external modulation. The perfection of the external modulation is flameinmind.com/flameinsound, which generates the same frequencies that go into Therapy, but then they can be beautifully mapped. And there's one we took the heart frequency and the brain frequency and the sex organ, and you can actually trigger a specific chakra, and people will feel it with that external. So it's actually kind of fun. Now, both devices are famous for successful remote healing effects as well, and Quantify it's really quite a fun toy. It's just much, much lower power. But if people are reasonably sensitive, you can have a whole lot of fun. And we're just beginning. Actually, you will see soon there'll be a new feedback section on Quantify. We're getting amazing new reports. So it's cheaper, much lower power. But for real professionals who have a center and they're doing regular healing, they need the higher power of the Therapy.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Dan. I have a bioponic institute, and we teach college level aquaponic and hydroponic greenhouse growing. Can you suggest what you would recommend for the best things to put in the greenhouses to help the plants grow?
Well, obviously, if I may, a shameless plug, but theimploder.com, the newest commercial ultra imploder there, is designed for that application, and you will get a hyper solubility and growth effect. It's amazing and virtually and pretty cool. So that's one basic. It's designed, it's gorgeous. Now, other things you could do. Well, zapping the seeds with Therapy.net plasma would be fun and fabulous, and you don't have to do it. You just go to a nearby Therapy center. That'd be a wonderful, fun thing. The other things we recommend, the fractalfield.com/bloomthedesert project used effective microorganisms. The original tab, they're very effective microorganisms, are wonderful. It used agricultural ormes. We have a new group in Australia. Talk to Roger Green for effective microorganisms. And of course, then you could actually tune that lighting by equation and perfect that. And we have experimental LED systems for that. So, and obviously, try to have that building be implosive capacitively. Reduce the steel and aluminum. Check your design. Check the magnetic line crosses. Do a spectrum analysis of the capacitance of that building. If that building is tuned to charge implosion, it will make a difference. Biologic architecture. goldenmean.info/architecture.
Foundations, NANS product.
Pardon?
The test foundations hands.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, you know, I was in Cachet's living room several times, and we had a lot of fun. And, you know, he really did have a nuclear background. Electrical engineering, he's kind of weak. And their GAN's product, there's many useful things there. Unfortunately, they never really understood the physics well enough to get the purities required. Our carbon nanogroup is far more advanced, we think. But those GAN's products, some of them will be quite useful because actually, if I may say, the most potent probably and more natural source would be deep seawater derived agricultural ormes would be a perfect analog to that of a much more natural and probably powerful source. Now our friends at priestessalchemy.com, they're making a lot of the ormes materials as they did for Pat Flanagan, Chaz there, and that's also some wonderful stuff to test. So yeah, a lot of stuff you could do. Agricultural ormes is basically living gold powder.
You mentioned the stone circle. Can you describe that? And also, there's a really good question in the chat about ghosts that I'm super curious about. So,
oh, can a ghost touch a living person? Okay, stone circle. Well, what we showed was that when you measure the magnetic line cross, which is where every effective stone circle is located, and then the capacitance implosion is tuned to that. For example, the blue stones are a higher dielectric than, which means more capacitively implosive, the result of which would be measurable if you take the power spectra of the weak electric field and measure the harmonic cascade. Examples, flameandmind.com/lifeforce, you could tune that stone circle. But stone circles, ideally like labyrinths, when they're properly doused on a magnetic line cross point, are a beautiful example of the technology of Ascension. Absolutely, and useful. And I recommend highly paramagnetic and highly piezoelectric stone, and I recommend learning to douse. Can ghosts touch a living person and that person would feel cold then? Well, the reason most ghost busters are able to measure the presence of many but not all ghosts by a simple cold spot is because if the ghost is in fact successfully imploding plasma, it will convert the heat, for the same reason Victor Schauberger's water vortex began spontaneously making voltage from gravity at the moment it spontaneously got colder. So if the ghost is eating the heat, that means at least the ghost is being fed. So will they feel it as a cold spot? But there's many variations on that theme. You know, your chakras will feel cold after bliss, but they might feel hot during the bliss. So it just depends where the pattern of the conductivity is. But in general, obviously the place of low resistance to charge is blissful. And it's also true that the place of spontaneous cooling is always an excellent indicator of where negentropy is happening. You know, sacred space often is spontaneously cooling for that reason. Like a bubble chain of memories. Well, I think my voice is starting to give out here. Any other important questions? Or
I have a question, Dan. I read a paper recently, it was published a few years ago by James Oshman, entitled The Heart is a Scalar Bidirectional Antenna. And I was wondering your thoughts on this. One of the things that he described in the paper was the geometry of the heart, and I forget the surgeon's name, this Spanish cardiologist who
Marinelli?
That doesn't sound right, but what he did, you know, he unfolded basically the heart as one long fascial strip, and when it the way that it forms as it grows, it basically is a triple helix, and that the hypothesis was that the geometry of the heart is what creates this.
Well, that work was done long ago. It was Lawrence Edwards' Fields of Form Vortex of Life used the Pettigrew dissections to show that the 7 layers of the muscle of the heart's compression are in fact precisely angularly arrayed with the 7 arrows of symmetry of a tetrahedron for a very precise reason. 7 arrows in the heart, because you have to throw the torus donut of the sequence of pressure moves in an accurate symmetry sequence. So you can actually throw a vortex of plasma longitudinally, as he rightly says, to any vector direction in the body, and the index of those vector directions are always the 7 arrows of the tetra, which is why that's exactly the physics of the origin of Hebrew. The 7 layers of heart muscle are well dissected. Our website on that with pictures, 7arrows.net. So that was behind Marinelli's famous paper, The Heart is Not a Pump, which started in that series, which basically the heart doesn't pump the blood so much as throw the vortex donuts, which he would correctly, your Oshman, who was with us, would correctly say is ideally longitudinal. So the symmetry of a heart muscle is a beautiful study, but I think, as you know, see the Pettigrew dissections at 7arrows.net from the book Fields of Form, Vortex of Life, Lawrence Edwards, whom I knew famously in the biodynamic tradition. So the 7 arrows of the layers of the heart muscle is a beautiful, you know, we titled that article, "You Could Not Get a Better Squeeze."
Thank you, Dan, so much for your time.
Thank you. Blessings. Really, stay in touch, everyone. My email is info@fractalfield.com, and we're here to serve. Thank you for the invite. Blessings. Bye.
While everybody's on the line here, just want to announce we have 2 more speakers before the event